Is it important? It's very crucial.
Groovy.
Little stereo.
I'll say kick it, and you'll just kick it with a tasty groove, okay? 1, 2, 3, kick it.
Woo!
Oh, hi, Mark.
He likes.
It's time for the most crucial podcast with your host, me, Mark Franchise.
Meow.
All right, welcome back to Most Crucial Podcast. Mark Franchise, your host here, and yes, we are doing it. Top 5 Tuesdays. We're going to be doing something new here going forward. A different topic on different days of the week. We're going to be focusing on local music. We're going to be focusing on some wrestling as well. If you're a fan of professional wrestling or we're a fan, also the top 5 Tuesday is what we're going to be doing going forward. And it's a chance for me to kind of reach out to you guys and get you to know a little bit about me, the way I kind of view music. And I'd also love to hear your feedback as well. I definitely want to have some people participate and to be on the show as well, get their feelings on their favorite bands, their favorite musicians, and that's kind of what we're going to be doing on the Top 5 Tuesday. I'm going to be counting down my top 5 lists that we're going to be putting together, and today's the first one. I'm going to be talking about the 5 greatest American rock bands from the 60s and 70s era, because this is a big time in music, I feel, in terms of rock and roll, that was possibly the greatest era of music of all time. We're talking about so many bands rising up, and this is the top 5 greatest American rock bands today. We'll get into the UK at another date as well, but I want to talk about American music in general, because you did have a lot of bands coming up in the 60s and 70s like The Who and Rolling Stones, but in America it was just such a changing time in the course of human history, where you had the Vietnam War, you had a lot of bands that were starting to stand up for people's rights, and there was just such a change in society going on, and it was reflective in the music, and the music was almost a reflection of what was happening in society, and because of that, the music changed, and it just got better. And I want to kind of give my opinion on who I feel the top 5 bands were. Now, this is just in terms of the live performance they put on, the energy behind their live shows, and who they are in general as performers and as people as well, and how they've changed my life. And we start the list off, number 5 is the Doobie Brothers, and I've had a chance to see these guys perform multiple times. One of the best live acts, considering most of the time when I've seen them, they've toured with either Chicago or Earth, Wind, and Fire, and they have no problem playing each other's music, which is kind of sweet, because these guys have probably been around so long and played alongside with these guys so many times that it's kind of a simple thing. But the Doobie Brothers, not only did they push out so many hits back in the 70s, but you listen to their music and you realize just how fun it is and the diverse range of music that they can play. It's truly phenomenal. Like I said, I've seen these guys so many times, and the most recent time they played at Firekeepers Casino Hotel for RKR's birthday bash, and it was a phenomenal show. They came out and they played a very different set. A lot of people who are just fans of the hits that they produce think we're a little thrown off by the set list that they chose. And for me, I thought it was sweet, because they were playing stuff off of albums that they never usually play, and they just wanted to give an audience something different. And as a fan of music, I really appreciate when bands do stuff like that, because sometimes it's those lesser known songs that are special to people, and the Doobie Brothers are one of those bands that like to do that. And they had success as well with Michael McDonald, but again, as you'll see with certain bands, there are certain members of bands that will kind of come in and almost change the dynamic of the band a little bit. And sometimes they can add a good sound because of that dynamic. But if it starts to take away the musical direction of the band and it starts to go a different way because of that change, I feel like that's kind of when they part ways. And that's kind of what the case was with Michael McDonald and the Doobie Brothers as well. It was getting a little bit more poppy, and it was kind of taken away from that classic, that hard rock vibe that the Doobie Brothers had. Although I do love Michael McDonald songs with the Doobie Brothers. They're fun. And the Doobie Brothers in general are great guys. I mean, those guys donate so much of their time to charity. They've done so many charity events. I watched a documentary on a music channel about them recently, and I learned a lot about them that I had no idea about. They do so much charity work and continue to put on awesome shows. And I definitely suggest, if you're ever in the market, if you haven't dove into the Doobie Brothers collection, pick up some of their old records and just listen to them straight through. That's kind of what vinyl was all about back in the day anyways. They were about, you wrote an album and you put it out there. And the listening experience on vinyl is different anyways. If I put a record on, I'm playing it from front to back. If you've got a CD, if you've got it digitally in your hand and you can just skip a song with the touch of a finger, it can kind of take away from an album. But I don't feel like many bands write full albums anymore. I think in the digital age, the mindset is much different. If you're going to put a record out, you are going to put a record out that you could back every single song. And not that artists don't necessarily back every single song now, but it kind of feels like the age of the album is slowly disappearing. But there's a lot of bands who still put it out there. So Doobie Brothers definitely make the top 5. Had to put them at number 5 because the number 4 band is a band that I got into really young, a musician whose voice has been heard for many decades. The name is synonymous, but the band that backed him was incredibly strong, and there's a few albums that prove this. Number 4 on the list is going to be Steve Miller Band. Steve Guitar Miller is one of the most well-known guitar players, frontmen in rock and roll. He gained huge success in the 80s. He had hits like Abracadabra. He had Take the Money and Run, Jungle Love. There's a lot of really well-known hits. The Joker, obviously, Fly Like an Eagle, dating back a little bit farther into the 70s. But you take a look at who he is and the fact that he's still performing today. And, they've slowed down a little bit. They're in their 70s. They're getting up there. And luckily, we've still got these guys around. They're still jamming out. They're still putting on awesome shows. I've seen Steve Miller. I saw him 2 years ago with Peter Frampton as well. Excellent show. They still put on a hell of a performance, but there's 2 albums in general that put Steve Miller on the top 5 for me. There was a performance called the King Biscuit Flower Hour. And if you go back, you'll find there were multiple artists, B.B. King included, that had these live shows. And the King Biscuit records by Steve Miller Band are some of the coolest live shows I've ever listened to. And that's what really got me into Steve Miller. It wasn't necessarily the hits that he had and the singles that he put out. As much as I love them, as much as they're well known, in a certain perspective, I feel that we've heard those. And for those of you who listen to Steve Miller or know about Steve Miller but haven't heard the King Biscuit Flower Hour albums, I definitely suggest you check those out because you're going to hear a completely different Steve Miller Band than you're accustomed to, with the likes of David Denny, who plays guitar on the album, Gary Malaber, who drummer, Rodney Turner, who's the bass player, and also with the accompaniment of Norton Buffalo, who is the original harmonica player, sadly no longer alive. He was the harmonica player for Commander Cody and his Lost Airmen as well. Such phenomenal live albums. I don't think I've ever fell so hard into a live album before. I mean, I think the only one I can think of really from an early age was AC/DC Live at Donington. Amazing live album. But the King Biscuit tapes, if you can locate these and listen to them, you'll hear a completely different style of Steve Miller Band than you're accustomed to. And it's something that changed my perspective of who Steve Miller was, what the band was all about back in the 70s. You get to hear him play a couple of the hits, like Fly Like an Eagle, Joker, but then there's some songs that you don't hear live, that he doesn't play live, and that aren't played the way they are played on this album anymore. That really changed my perspective of who he was as a musician and who the band was in general. And probably one of the most listened to albums that I've ever listened to in my life, because it's just phenomenal. So if you have the chance, pick up those albums, check them out. Even if you're not a fan of Steve Miller because you don't like the hits, definitely check these albums out. It'll change your perspective of how you see it. Number 3, when it comes to the 5 greatest American 60s, 70s rock bands, is a band that is very much rooted in Detroit, even though they're not from Detroit. A band that has 3 live albums, and those 3 albums were each recorded at different venues in the Detroit area. Jay Giles Band is one of the greatest American rock bands of all time. Full House was recorded at the Cinderella Ballroom. Blow Your Face Out was recorded partially in Boston at the Garden, and the rest of the album was recorded at Cobo. And the third album, Showtime, was recorded in the early 80s at Pine Knob, now DTE Energy Music Theater. And none of the songs repeat on those 3 live albums. Whatever songs you hear on Full House, you will not hear on Blow Your Face Out. And likewise, on Blow Your Face Out, you won't hear on Showtime. And that in itself is amazing. The fact that they chose Detroit to record their 3 live albums in, I find incredibly amazing, because as a Boston band, they always considered Detroit a second home. Peter Wolf, the lead vocalist, would always say, when we came to Detroit back in the 70s, it would be a week-long excursion where we'd leave with our tail between our legs, because that's exactly what Detroit would do to us. And it's not even just Detroit, too. I feel that Michigan in general has always embraced the Jay Giles Band, and they've always shown support for Michigan as well, always coming back. When they originally did their reunion after the initial breakup in the 80s for the new millennium, they came to Detroit, and then it had been years since they had even played Michigan, and then they had actually played Michigan 4 years in a row recently before the tragic passing of Jay Giles. But you listen to those live albums, and you listen to their albums in general, and you find out that they have such good writing. Seth Justman, the keyboard player, plays in perfect harmony with the song that Jay Giles written. And it's always been described, Jay Giles Band, as 6 members who all look very different, but are of the same mindset. And it's like a gang of 6 different looking dudes who came together. Stephen Joe Blad, the drummer, Danny Klein, the bass player, Seth Justman on keyboards, Peter Wolf, the vocalist, Magic Dick, one of the best harp players of all time, and then, of course, Jay Giles. To watch live footage of these guys and to see these guys live was something phenomenal. And unfortunately, I never got to see Stephen Joe Blad on drums. He wasn't a part of the initial reunion when I went and had seen them 3 years in a row. But the 5 core guys of Jay Giles Band did play 2 of the years that I had seen them. Actually, all 3 years that I had seen them. And shortly after, there was an issue with Jay Giles' health, his involvement with the band, and it led to some personal issues between him and the band, which was unfortunate. But you take a look at their live performance and you listen to their albums. The live albums really are where it's at. If you're going to listen to their albums, start with their live albums. You'll understand who they were as a band. They actually did a House Party live album. It's actually a DVD and live album from Germany that they released a few years back, which is fantastic. But again, Full House, Blow Your Face Out, and Showtime, all 3 shows live from Detroit. you can almost envision what the show was like. And it's just mind-boggling. These albums are so awesome. And the fact that you're listening to something that was live in Detroit, you really get that feel, that understanding that this was a phenomenal, phenomenal show. And some of the best live albums you'll ever hear. And they brought so much energy to their music. And they've always said, we will go as hard as our audience wants us to go. Our audience will determine how hard we play. And I'll tell you what, when I first saw them in, I believe it was 2013, when they came to the Fillmore, I was blown away. I never thought I would be able to see these guys live. And then they announced a reunion. And then they came back, and Peter Wolf walks out on stage with a fifth of Jack and sets it down, and they play the entire Full House album from beginning to end. And I couldn't believe it. And that was just the beginning of the show. And that right there just showed me the fact that they played so hard, and they just kept going harder and harder and harder as the night went on. And they've, like I said, they've always said the crowd will determine the pace in which we play, the amount of energy that we give. And they've said many times before, there's really no party like a Detroit party. Again, they wrote the song Detroit Breakdown, coinciding with that mindset, as well as they know Detroit is Detroit Rock City, and that's where it's at. And that's why Jay Giles is always going to be one of my favorite rock bands of all time. Number 2 on the list is somewhat controversial in the sense that when we're talking about guitar players, or we're talking about bands in general, it's very easy to confuse one musician apart from the entire band. And I have to make that very clear that this is not the greatest guitar players list. This is the top 5 greatest American rock bands from the 60s and 70s era, in my opinion, just with my experiences of seeing them live, listening to them, and how I feel they impacted music. Now, number 2 on the list is someone who I consider the greatest guitar player of all time for what he's done for music, but it makes the number 2 on the list because of what the band was all about and how they reached success at a very, very young age. Santana. Santana is one of those groups that came in early 70s, late 60s, is actually 69 was when their debut album dropped, the self-titled Santana album. And there's a couple interviews actually with Carlos Santana when he talks about how they were prepped for Woodstock. And I think Woodstock cemented Santana as one of the premier bands of the 60s and 70s era. And they were starting to build up their audiences. They were getting booked on these shows that were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They were going to bigger audiences, bigger venues. They were stealing fans from like Grateful Dead and these other bands. They were stealing fans. They started to get traction. And Santana said before that, but by the time they got to Woodstock, in front of, what could be estimated as about 500,000 people, they were accustomed to these huge shows. But they were still dumbfounded by this whole thing. And now the whole funny story about Santana, about that Woodstock thing, is that they dropped acid and they didn't think that they were going to have to go on stage anytime soon. I think they thought they were supposed to play the next day or something. And then it ended up being, oh, you guys got to go on in an hour. So they were high on LSD during their entire Woodstock performance. And the rendition of Soul Sacrifice is just about the best live version of any song you'll ever see. And how he did that, he actually shares his experience on YouTube. He talks about his guitar turning into an electric snake, like the neck of his guitar. And it's wild. You can look it up on YouTube. He talks about that experience at Woodstock. But just in general, the way he writes music, the mindset, his band has always changed, and it's always circled around him. But he's always surrounded himself with the right musicians and the right people. You look at some of the original members of his band who had gone on, his keyboard player ended up going on to form Journey as well. And you look at and listen at some of these albums, and they're just phenomenal. If you've never listened to the live album Sacred Fire from South America, you're really missing out on one of the best live albums you'll ever listen to. And it's still up there. I'm still trying to decide. I'm still working through these lists. I'm just starting to put this together. Sacred Fire, it's very hard when you listen to that album to say it's not the greatest live album ever, because it's so passionate and it's so powerful, and he plays the guitar like it's coming right from his soul, and the band is so strong. And that's really why Santana makes the number 2 on the list of bands in general, because he's always had the best of the best. Whatever they're playing on his album or at his shows, it's the best of the best. He's not going to get a schmo. He's only surrounding himself with world-class musicians, and that's what makes his music so great. That's what makes the band so great, is they've always had the best musicians in Santana, because everybody wants to work with the greatest guitar player in the world, Carlos Santana. It's just that simple. That's why he's never had an issue finding people who want to work with him. And he's just about to put out a new album to Africa Speaks, which I'm so looking forward to, because there's some groundbreaking stuff on there, and cannot wait to see what he still comes up with. Now we get to the greatest American 60s and 70s rock band of all time, in my opinion. And remember, this is just my opinion for the Top 5 Tuesdays. It is not anything that is official. It's just from my experience. When you look at a band and you look at musicians in general, I've always wondered, how does a band so diverse write a song so complex? Sometimes you'll listen to music and you'll hear songs that blow your mind, and you wonder, how was that constructed? You know, how do you sit down and you have all these parts and all these voices through instruments? And how do you make something like that? How do you get that finished product? And I don't think a band has ever made me ponder that so many times as Chicago Transit Authority, or Chicago, who make the number 1 list, in my opinion, as the greatest American rock band of the 60s and 70s. 6 guys who came together, were doing top 40 hits, and when they finally discovered, we know what we're doing. We have the ability. We've got songs. Let's focus on our stuff. And they were getting fired from clubs, and they formed this group of the best possible musicians that they could find in the area. And from a very, very early point, they were changing the world. They were changing the world of music. A lot of people consider Jimi Hendrix the greatest guitar player of all time, and it's very hard to argue that. Jimi Hendrix straight up came up to Walter Perezader, who is the sax player for Chicago, and tapped him on the shoulder at a gig when they were opening up for Albert King, and he said, "Man, the horns are like 3 sets of lungs, 3 sets of voices. They're like voices on top of the vocals. And you've got a guitar player that's way better than me in Terry Kath, who is easily one of the most underrated guitar players of all time." Terry Kath was with Chicago up until his untimely death. Hot Streets was the first Chicago album without Terry Kath on it. And when you look at the band Chicago for who they were, you have to acknowledge Walter Perezader, Lee Loughnane, and Jimmy Pankow as one of the greatest horn trios, if not the greatest horn trio in any band of all time. Then you look at a guitar player like Terry Kath, who was just playing on emotion. And I mean, like Jimi Hendrix said, Jimi Hendrix considered him a way better guitar player than even himself, which speaks to the humbleness of Jimi Hendrix and the way he viewed music. But one of the greatest tenor singers of all time in Peter Cetera. Say what you will about Peter Cetera's solo career. I view Peter Cetera in the sense that in Chicago, he was a tremendous asset. Without Chicago, not so much. A great voice, no doubt, but his voice was made for that band. One of the greatest American songwriters of all time, Robert Lamb, a phenomenal keyboard player. And to go back to Peter Cetera too, a tremendous bass player. His bass playing on those early Chicago albums was phenomenal. But Robert Lamm, one of the greatest American songwriters of all time, literally showed up to the band when they first began and apparently had a book a few inches deep, just full of lyrics and songs. Had all these songs that he had in the bank. And they said, yeah, well, those will probably come in handy one day. And I think they did, honestly, because you listen to all these hits that he had. You listen to all these songs that are so memorable. And I don't think there's ever been a songwriter who's written songs that are so memorable as Robert Lamm. And he's still going today. And they've always said, a band is just like a family. There's changes that are going to come, and everybody's replaceable. And a lot of people will clown on bands like Earth, Wind, and Fire in Chicago who have gone through lineup changes, but it's really about the spirit of the music. If you've got the spirit in you and you can continue to play it and make it live, nobody's got a right to say that you aren't the same band. Yes, it's not the same band from the 70s, and that's totally understandable to say. However, they're still going. And they still have world-class musicians playing for them. And they wrote so many good songs. Those first two albums, Chicago Transit Authority and Chicago 2, are two of the greatest albums I've ever heard. And they were so different, and there was nothing like that. If you listen on Chicago 2 to A Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan, is written by Jimmy Pankow. And it's a phenomenal transition of music that just starts off so upbeat, and it goes through different sections, and it's actually a combination of 6 or 7 songs with a reprise of Make Me Smile at the very end. It starts with Make Me Smile, and it goes through a reprise at the very end to bring it back in. It's one of the most amazing arrangements ever. There's nothing like that nowadays. You don't hear music written like that nowadays. And I really hope to be able to talk to one of those guys and to try to get into that mindset of how they created something that magnificent. Because I've never experienced anything like that before when listening to it. I've never experienced that feeling I get when I listen to their horns. It's something that no other band has ever done, and I don't think another band will ever accomplish again. But those are my top 5 bands, the greatest American rock bands of the 60s and 70s. Let me know what you think. If you've got different opinions, let me know. Definitely open to suggesting to hear what you guys think about it. We'll be back with the Most Crucial podcast again soon. Thanks for chilling. Peace.
Why don't you make like a tree and get the fuck out of here?
Go home. Are you too good for your home?
Hey, you guys, I'm going home.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.